candle fell, before Alara Whitmore even understood why her hands were shaking. Hot wax splashed across the marble floor of Ashworth Hall, and every head in the ballroom turned toward the sound. For one terrible second, she thought the whole world had stopped breathing just to watch her fail. She had known this night would be difficult. She had not known it would begin with disaster. Her mother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, stood only a few feet away, her smile frozen in place, like a painting left out too long in the sun. Alara could see the flicker of panic behind her mother's eyes, the same panic that had lived in their house for 3 years now, ever since her father's business ventures had collapsed and taken the family's fortune down with them. "Pick it up, quickly," her mother whispered through her teeth, though there was nothing left to pick up. The candle had rolled beneath a table, and a servant was already rushing forward with a cloth. Alara wanted to disappear. She had wanted to disappear from the moment the invitation arrived at their door, sealed with the crest of the Duke of Ashworth, a man so wealthy and so guarded that most of society had never seen him smile. The invitation had not been meant for her. It had been meant for her older sisters, Beatrice and Clara, both of whom were considered the loveliest women in the county. Alara had only been included because a family could not send 2 daughters to a ball without the third looking abandoned at home. "You did not need to come tonight," Beatrice said quietly, fanning herself as she watched the servant clean the wax from the floor. There was no cruelty in her voice, only the tired honesty of an older sister who had said the same thing many times before. "You could have stayed with the housekeeper. No one would have noticed." "Mother wanted all 3 of us here," Alara answered, keeping her voice steady even though her chest felt tight. "She says a house looks less desperate when it has more daughters to show off." Clara laughed under her breath, not unkindly, but she did not disagree either. The truth was simple, and it was cruel in its simplicity. The Whitmore family needed a miracle, and everyone in that ballroom knew it. Their father's debts had grown too large to hide, and unless one of his daughters married well before the year's end, the family estate would be sold to cover what was owed. Beatrice and Clara were the ones expected to save them. Alara was merely expected to stand quietly in the corner and not embarrass anyone. She had accepted that role a long time ago. It did not hurt anymore, or so she told herself. The ballroom of Ashworth Hall was the grandest room Alara had ever stood inside. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light, and the walls were lined with paintings of ancestors who had built an empire out of land, trade, and careful marriages. Every young woman of appropriate age and fortune in the county had been invited, because tonight, for the first time in nearly a decade, the Duke of Ashworth was looking for a wife. His name was Julian, though few people dared to use it. He was known instead by his title, spoken with a mixture of admiration and fear. He had inherited the dukedom young, after his father's health began to fail, and in the years since, he had built a reputation as a man who trusted no one and forgave nothing. There were rumors of a broken engagement in his past, a woman who had wanted his fortune more than she had wanted him, though no one knew the full truth of what happened. What everyone did know was that the old duke, now confined to his bed and given only months to live, had demanded that his son marry before the year ended. A dukedom needed an heir, and an heir needed a mother who could be trusted. So the invitations had gone out, and the county had responded with a hunger that Alara found almost frightening. Every mother in the room tonight had a daughter she believed was destined to become the next Duchess of Ashworth. Every daughter had rehearsed her smile, her curtsy, her clever remarks, all in the hope of catching the eye of a man who had not smiled in public for years. Alara had rehearsed nothing. She had come only because refusing would have caused more trouble than attending. "There he is," Clara whispered suddenly, gripping Alara's arm. Alara followed her sister's gaze to the top of the grand staircase, where a tall figure had appeared, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light around him rather than reflect it. He did not smile as he descended. He did not wave or nod to the crowd the way most hosts would. He simply walked down the stairs, as though the ball were an obligation to be endured rather than an evening to be enjoyed. Julian Ashworth was younger than Alara had expected, though the weight of responsibility on his shoulders made him seem older than his years. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw set in a hard line, and his eyes swept across the crowded room with the careful assessment of a man counting enemies rather than admirers. Every conversation in the ballroom dropped to a whisper. Every fan stopped moving mid-air. It was as if the entire room had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe out again. "He looks like he would rather be anywhere else," Elara murmured, more to herself than to her sisters. "He looks like a man worth 10,000 pounds a year," Clara replied without hesitation. "Which means it does not matter where he would rather be." Elara said nothing to that. She understood her sister's practical view of the world, even if it left a strange, hollow feeling in her chest whenever she heard it spoken aloud. The evening moved forward in the way these evenings always did. The Duke greeted his guests with brief, polite words that carried no real warmth. Young women were introduced to him one after another, their mothers hovering nearby like anxious birds guarding their nests. He responded to each with the same measured courtesy, the same distant politeness, the same careful distance that told everyone in the room he had built walls around himself, that no ball gown or clever compliment could break through. Elara watched from the edges of the room, half hidden behind a column, content to observe rather than participate. She had long ago learned that invisibility, while lonely, was also safe. No one mocked a woman they did not notice. No one whispered about a woman who did not draw attention to herself. It was during one of these quiet moments, while she stood near the refreshment table, watching servants carry silver trays of wine through the crowd, that everything changed. A servant stumbled. It was a small thing, the kind of accident that happens in any crowded room. But the tray in his hands tipped forward, and a full glass of red wine went sailing through the air, directly toward a man who had just stepped out from behind a curtain to escape the noise of the ballroom. Elara did not think. She reached out and caught the servant's arm before he could fall completely, steadying him, but not before a splash of wine had already struck the sleeve of the man in front of her. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, reaching for a cloth from the table, before she had even looked up to see whose sleeve she was apologizing to. "Please, let me help. It will stain if it is not treated right away." She stopped speaking the moment she saw his face. It was him, the Duke of Ashworth, standing close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes, lines that no one in the crowded ballroom seemed to have noticed from a distance. Her hands froze mid-motion, the cloth still held out toward him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elara expected anger. She expected the cold, dismissive tone that everyone said the Duke reserved for anyone who inconvenienced him. Instead, he looked at the cloth in her hand, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a door opening a crack before deciding whether to open further. "It was not your doing," he said finally, his voice quieter than she expected, without the sharp edge she had heard him use with the guests earlier. "The servant lost his footing. You caught him before he fell. That is more than most people in this room would have bothered to do." Elara did not know how to respond to that. She had expected to be dismissed, perhaps scolded for standing too close, certainly not thanked. "The wine will still ruin your coat," she said instead, because it was easier to speak about fabric than about the strange way her heart was suddenly pounding. "If you allow me, I know a trick with salt and cold water that can lift the stain before it sets." "You know how to remove wine stains," he repeated, as though the idea amused him in some small, private way. "My family has not always had servants to manage such things," she admitted, and then immediately regretted the honesty of it. Society did not reward women who spoke plainly about reduced circumstances. It rewarded women who pretended their families had never known hardship at all. But the Duke did not look away in embarrassment for her. If anything, he seemed to lean slightly closer, as though her words had caught his attention in a way that no rehearsed compliment from the evening had managed to do. "Most people who come to Ashworth Hall tell me things they believe I want to hear," he said. "You are the first person tonight who has told me something true without meaning to impress me." Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she could not tell if it was from embarrassment or something else entirely. "I did not realize who you were when I spoke," she admitted. "If I had known, I might have said something far more foolish." For the briefest moment, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but Elara had seen it, and she suspected she was one of very few people in the ballroom who had. "Ashworth," called a voice from across the room, and Elara watched the shutters close again behind the Duke's eyes as an older gentleman approached, clearly one of his advisors, judging by the urgency in his stride. "Ashworth, your father's physician has sent word. He wishes to speak with you before the hour grows too late." The Duke's expression hardened instantly, The brief warmth of a moment ago folded away like a letter placed back inside its envelope. "Excuse me," he said to Alara, his voice returning to the same polished distance he had used with every other guest that evening. "I am needed elsewhere." "Of course," Alara said, stepping back and lowering her eyes as etiquette demanded. He walked away without looking back, his advisor already speaking urgently into his ear, about matters Alara could not hear. She stood alone by the refreshment table for a long moment, the cloth still in her hand, wondering if the strange conversation had truly happened, or if she had imagined the entire exchange out of nervous exhaustion. "What did he say to you?" Clara's voice appeared suddenly at her shoulder, sharp with curiosity. Her sister must have been watching from across the room. "I saw him standing close to you. What on earth did you say?" "Nothing important," Alara said, though her heart was still beating faster than it should have been. "There was an accident with a servant's tray. I only offered to help with a stain." Clara studied her with narrowed eyes, the way she always did when she suspected there was more to a story than her sister was willing to share. "The Duke of Ashworth does not stop to speak with anyone for longer than a few polite words, unless he has a reason to," she said slowly. "And you were standing there far longer than a few words would require." "It was nothing," Alara repeated, though even as she said it, she found herself glancing toward the staircase where he had disappeared, wondering what news waited for him beyond the ballroom doors, and wondering, foolishly, whether he might think of their brief conversation again, once the night was over. She did not know, standing there with a stained cloth in her hand, and her sister's suspicious eyes upon her, that the moment she had just lived through would change the course of her entire life. She did not know that somewhere upstairs, behind a closed door, an old and dying duke was asking his son the very question that would soon bring her name, of all names, into a conversation she never expected to be part of. All she knew, as the music began again and the crowd resumed its careful dance of ambition and hope, was that for the first time that evening she had been seen. And she could not stop wondering why. The rest of the ball passed in a blur of forgettable conversations and polite refusals. Alara danced twice, once with a merchant's son who spoke only of horses, and once with an elderly gentleman who mistook her for someone else entirely, and called her by the wrong name 3 times, before the song ended. Neither dance meant anything to her. Her mind kept drifting back to the refreshment table, to the brief flicker of something human, in a man the world had decided was made of stone. By the time the carriage arrived to take the Whitmore family home, the night sky had turned the deep, quiet blue that comes just before true darkness. Alara sat pressed against the carriage window, watching the lights of Ashworth Hall shrink into the distance behind them, and she wondered if she would ever see those halls again. She told herself it did not matter either way. Men like the Duke of Ashworth did not choose women like her. Fortune chose fortune. Beauty chose beauty. The world had rules, and Alara had learned those rules well enough to know exactly where she stood within them. She was the daughter with no dowry worth mentioning, the sister who blended into corners, the name added to lists only because a family needed to appear whole. She was not the kind of woman a duke remembered after a single conversation by a refreshment table. And yet, as the carriage rattled along the dark road toward home, she found herself touching the small stain of wine, still faintly visible on the edge of her sleeve. A mark left behind, from a night she suspected she would never fully forget. No matter how hard the world tried to convince her it meant nothing at all. The old Duke's bedchamber smelled of medicine and burning candle wax, a smell that had become so familiar to Julian Ashworth over the past year that he barely noticed it anymore. What he noticed instead was how much smaller his father looked each time he visited, as though the illness were slowly folding him inward, taking pieces of him that would never return. "You left your own ball to sit with me," the old Duke said, his voice thin, but still carrying the sharp authority that had commanded respect for 40 years. "That was foolish, Julian. Tonight was not for me. It was for you." "The physician said you wished to speak with me," Julian replied, taking the chair beside the bed that had become his in the last several months. "I assumed it was urgent." "Everything feels urgent when a man believes he has little time left," his father said, and though he tried to make the words sound light, there was no hiding the truth beneath them. "But yes, it is urgent. I want to know what progress you have made tonight. Have you found anyone among that crowd of hopeful young women who might be worth your attention?" Julian hesitated, and in that hesitation, An image rose unbidden in his mind. A young woman with a cloth in her hand, apologizing for an accident that was not her fault, speaking to him as though he were simply a man and not a title to be won. There were many candidates, he said carefully, avoiding a direct answer. Beautiful, accomplished, exactly as expected. That is not what I asked, his father said, studying his son's face with the sharp attention of a man who had spent decades reading contracts and character alike. I asked if you found anyone worth your attention. Beauty and accomplishment are common enough among the daughters of this county. I want to know if anyone caught your interest. Julian thought again of the brief conversation by the refreshment table, of the honesty in her voice when she admitted her family had not always had servants, of the surprise on her face when she realized who she was speaking to. There may have been one, he admitted finally, though he kept his tone carefully neutral, unwilling to give the moment more weight than it deserved. A minor incident, nothing more. It is unlikely to matter. Everything matters, his father said, his voice growing weaker, even as his conviction remained strong. I do not have the luxury of time to watch you court a woman slowly over the course of a year, Julian. I need to know before I close my eyes for the last time that this family will continue, that there will be an heir, that the name Ashworth will not end with the two of us in this room. You understand what I am asking of you? I understand, Julian said quietly, and he did, more than his father perhaps realized. He understood the weight of duty better than most men his age, having carried it since he was barely 20 years old. He understood what it meant to marry not for affection, but for necessity, because he had watched his own parents do precisely that, and had learned, painfully, what a marriage without true connection could become. Bring me a list, his father said, closing his eyes as exhaustion finally overtook him. A list of candidates. I want to see the names of the women who attended tonight, and I want you to choose from among them before the month is finished. Do not wait for love to find you, Julian. Love is a luxury this family cannot afford right now. Choose someone steady, someone who will not embarrass this house. That is all I ask. Julian sat with his father until the old man's breathing evened into sleep, and then he rose quietly and left the chamber, closing the door behind him, with the careful softness of a man who had learned to move through grief without making a sound. His advisor, Mr. Pemberton, was waiting for him in the hallway, a stack of papers already tucked beneath his arm. I have taken the liberty of preparing a preliminary list, Your Grace, Pemberton said, following Julian down the corridor with quick, efficient steps. Based on family standing, dowry, and reputation, there are 7 names that stand above the rest. I believe any one of them would make a suitable match. Show me, Julian said, though his mind was still distracted by his father's failing voice and by the strange lingering memory of wine spilled on his sleeve. Pemberton unrolled the list as they walked, reading names aloud in the practiced tone of a man accustomed to presenting reports. Lady Ophelia Grantham, daughter of an earl, known for her charm and her family's extensive land holdings. Miss Lucinda Hartley, whose father owned half the shipping trade along the eastern coast. Miss Vivian Ashcombe, celebrated as the most accomplished pianist in the county. The names continued, one after another, each accompanied by a brief summary of wealth, beauty, and social standing, as though the women themselves were entries in a ledger, rather than living people with thoughts and feelings of their own. And the 7th name? Julian asked, when Pemberton paused. A formality only, Your Grace, Pemberton said, glancing briefly at the paper before continuing. Miss Alara Whitmore. Her family's fortune has declined significantly in recent years, and she brings little in the way of dowry or connections. I included her only because her family attended tonight alongside her sisters, and I did not wish to appear as though I were excluding any eligible woman from the county without cause. I would not consider her a serious candidate. Julian stopped walking. Whitmore, he repeated slowly, and something in his chest tightened at the sound of the name. A small recognition clicking into place like a key finding its lock. Describe her. Pemberton looked briefly surprised by the request, but answered dutifully. Quiet, unremarkable in appearance, compared to her sisters, though I am told she is intelligent. Her family's decline began 3 years ago, when her father's investments failed. There has been some talk of the estate being sold to cover the debts, should no favorable marriage be arranged soon. Julian said nothing for a long moment, his mind returning again to the refreshment table, to the honest, unguarded way she had spoken to him without knowing who he was, to the small, surprised warmth he had felt at being seen not as a title, but simply as a man who had wine on his sleeve. "Keep her name on the list," he said finally. Pemberton blinked, clearly caught off guard by the instruction. "Your Grace, I must advise against giving her serious consideration. Her family circumstances make her an unwise choice from a practical standpoint, and society will certainly question." "Keep her name on the list," Julian repeated, his voice leaving no further room for argument. "I will decide for myself who is worth consideration, and who is not. That is not a decision I intend to delegate." Pemberton pressed his lips into a thin line, but said nothing further, simply making a small note beside the seventh name before rolling the list closed once more. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, Julian's thoughts far from the practical matters of dowries and landholdings that so often govern decisions like this one. He thought instead of a woman who had not known his name when she offered to help him, who had spoken of removing wine stains with the same seriousness most women in that ballroom reserved for discussing fashion and gossip, who had blushed not from flattery but from honesty caught unexpectedly in the open. He did not know why the memory had settled so firmly in his mind, when he had spoken to a dozen other women that same evening, and could barely recall their faces now. He only knew that something about her had felt different, real, in a way that nothing else that night had managed to feel. The following morning, word began to spread through the county, with the speed such things always traveled among households eager for news. The Duke of Ashworth intended to meet each of the 7 candidates individually over the coming weeks, a private audience meant to help him make his final decision. Every family with a daughter on that list scrambled to prepare her for the meeting, hiring tutors for last-minute lessons in conversation and etiquette, commissioning new gowns, coaching daughters on which topics to raise and which to avoid entirely. The Whitmore household received the news with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "There must be some mistake," Lady Margaret said, reading the formal letter for the 3rd time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more sensible. Why would they include Alara's name on such a list? Beatrice and Clara, certainly, but Alara has no dowry to speak of. "Perhaps it is simply a courtesy," Beatrice suggested, though even she seemed puzzled by the inclusion. "A way of appearing fair to every family who attended, without any real intention behind it." Alara said nothing as her mother and sisters discussed the letter, though her hands trembled slightly as she remembered the brief conversation by the refreshment table, the flicker of warmth in a man's eyes that the world insisted was made of ice. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not choose penniless daughters over wealthy heiresses, no matter how kindly a conversation had gone. She told herself this so firmly, in fact, that she nearly believed it by the time the letter confirming her individual audience with the Duke arrived 3 days later, addressed in careful, formal handwriting directly to her name. Her mother read it aloud with growing astonishment, and for the first time in years, Alara saw something other than disappointment flicker across her mother's face when she looked at her youngest daughter. "You are to meet with him," Lady Margaret said slowly, as though testing the words to see if they were real. "Alone, next Tuesday, at 11 in the morning." Alara felt her stomach twist into a knot of fear and disbelief, so tightly wound together that she could not separate one feeling from the other. She thought of the Duke's eyes softening slightly as he studied her, of his voice growing quieter when he told her she had spoken something true without meaning to impress him, and she wondered, with a mixture of hope and dread that frightened her more than either feeling alone, what on earth she was supposed to say to a duke when given a private audience she had never expected and did not believe she deserved. "What will I even wear?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone in the room, and for the first time in a long while, her sisters did not laugh at the question. They simply looked at her, seeing her, perhaps, for the first time in years, as something other than the daughter who was expected to fade quietly into the background of every family gathering. Whatever happened next, Alara understood one thing clearly as she folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. Her life, whether she wanted it to or not, had just begun to change in ways she could neither predict nor control. The morning of the audience arrived far too quickly, and not quickly enough, both at the same time. In the strange way that dreaded and hoped-for moments often do, Alara stood in front of the small mirror in her bedchamber, smoothing down the front of a pale green gown that had once belonged to Beatrice, altered carefully by their housekeeper, to fit her narrower frame. "You look lovely," her mother said from the doorway, though her voice carried more nervous energy than genuine confidence. "Remember to speak only when spoken to. Keep your answers brief and pleasant. Do not mention the debts. Do not mention your father's failed investments. And whatever you do not contradict him on any subject, no matter how strongly you might feel about it." "Yes, mother," Alara said, though privately she wondered if contradicting a man might be exactly what had drawn his attention to her in the first place. She said nothing of this thought aloud. There seemed little point in arguing with advice that came from years of careful survival within society's rules. The carriage ride to Ashworth Hall felt longer than it had the night of the ball, though the distance had not changed. Alara pressed her gloved hands together in her lap, watching the countryside roll past the window, trying to steady the rapid beating of her heart with slow, careful breaths that did very little to calm her. When the carriage finally arrived, she was led not to the grand ballroom she remembered from before, but to a smaller, quieter sitting room at the back of the house, where morning light spilled through tall windows and illuminated shelves lined with books that looked as though they had actually been read, rather than simply displayed for appearance. The Duke was already seated when she entered, though he rose immediately upon seeing her, a courtesy she had not expected from a man whose reputation suggested coldness in every gesture. "Miss Whitmore," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his own. "Thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying carefully, before taking her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alara studied the pattern of the rug beneath her feet, uncertain how to begin, painfully aware that 6 other women had likely sat in this same chair over the past several days, each one more polished and more prepared for this exact conversation than she felt herself to be. "I imagine you are wondering why your name appears on a list you did not expect to be part of," Julian said finally, breaking the silence with a directness that caught her off guard. "I confess, I have wondered exactly that, Your Grace," Alara admitted, deciding that honesty, having served her well once before, might serve her well again now. "My family's circumstances are not what most would consider suitable for a match such as this." "No," he agreed, and something in his tone suggested he respected the honesty of her answer more than he would have respected a polite denial. "They are not, and yet here you are." "Here I am," she repeated, unsure what else to say. "Tell me something," Julian said, leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Every woman I have spoken with these past several days has told me precisely what she believes I wish to hear, that she admires my family's history, that she would be honored to manage a household as grand as Ashworth Hall, that she has always dreamed of a match built on mutual respect and quiet devotion. I have heard these same phrases so many times now that I could recite them in my sleep." He paused, studying her carefully. "I do not wish to hear rehearsed phrases from you, Miss Whitmore. I would rather hear the truth, even if the truth is unflattering. Why do you believe you were included on this list?" Alara hesitated, her mother's careful instructions echoing faintly in her mind, warnings against contradiction and unpleasant honesty. But something about the way he looked at her, waiting with genuine curiosity, rather than polite expectation, made her set those warnings quietly aside. "I believe I was included as a courtesy," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "Perhaps your advisor did not wish to appear as though he had excluded any eligible woman without cause. I do not believe anyone, including myself, expected this meeting to lead anywhere beyond a polite formality." Julian's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "And what do you believe now, sitting here in this room?" "I believe I still do not understand why I am here," she admitted, her cheeks warming with the honesty of the confession. "I have very little to offer a man in your position, Your Grace. No significant dowry, no connections of consequence to strengthen your family's standing. I would understand entirely if this conversation concluded exactly where it began, with my name quietly removed from consideration." "Would that trouble you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost gentle, in a way she had not expected from a man whose reputation suggested such gentleness did not exist within him. Alara considered the question honestly before answering. "I do not wish to be chosen out of pity, Your Grace, if that is what you are asking. I would rather remain exactly as I am, overlooked but at peace with my circumstances, than be selected simply because my family's misfortune makes for a sympathetic story among the ton. If you are searching for a wife who will bring wealth or connection to strengthen this family, I am certainly not the correct choice, and I would rather you know that plainly now than discover it with disappointment later." For a long moment, Julian said nothing at all. He simply studied her, with an expression she could not quite read, something between surprise and quiet admiration settling across his features. "You are the first woman who has sat in that chair and told me I am not the correct choice for her," he said finally, and there was something almost like amusement threading through his voice now. "Every other candidate has spent the better part of an hour convincing me why she is precisely what this family needs. You have spent 5 minutes explaining why I should look elsewhere." "I did not mean to offend you, Your Grace," Alara said quickly, her stomach twisting with sudden worry that her honesty had gone too far. "You have not offended me," he said, and to her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. The same small, private, almost smile she had glimpsed once before by the refreshment table. "You have done something far more difficult than offending me. You have surprised me." I did not believe that was still possible, given how predictable these conversations had become. Alara did not know how to respond to that, so she remained silent, watching him carefully as he rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back, in the manner of a man gathering his thoughts before speaking them aloud. "My father is dying," he said finally, his back still turned toward her, his voice carrying a rawness she suspected very few people had ever heard from him. "He wishes to see me married before he passes, so that he might die, knowing this family's future is secured. It is not a romantic reason to seek a wife, I am aware. It is not the reason most women dream of when they imagine their own courtship. Grief and duty rarely leave room for romance," Alara said quietly, and she meant it with more understanding than perhaps he realized. She had watched her own family crumble under the weight of financial ruin, had watched her mother's careful smiles cover exhaustion and fear night after night, and she understood, more deeply than most young women her age, what it meant to make difficult choices out of necessity rather than desire. Julian turned back to face her, something in his expression softening further. "You understand duty," he said, more of an observation than a question. "I understand it very well, Your Grace," she replied. "My family has needed saving for 3 years now. I have simply not been the daughter expected to do the saving, and yet perhaps you are the daughter capable of understanding what this marriage would actually require," he said slowly, as though the thought were forming itself even as he spoke it aloud. "Not admiration, not flattery, understanding." Alara felt her heart quicken at his words, though she could not tell if it was hope or fear that caused the sudden rush of feeling in her chest. "Your Grace, I do not wish to presume." "I am not asking you to presume anything, Miss Whitmore," he said gently, returning to his seat across from her. "I am simply telling you that this conversation has been more valuable to me than the 6 that came before it, and I intend to think carefully on everything you have said today." The remainder of their meeting passed in quieter conversation, discussions of books they had both read, the state of the roads leading into the county, small and unremarkable topics that nonetheless felt more genuine to Alara than any exchange she had shared with another person in a very long time. When at last the audience concluded and she rose to leave, Julian walked her to the door himself, a courtesy she suspected he did not extend to every guest who passed through Ashworth Hall. "Thank you for your honesty today," he said as she stepped toward her waiting carriage. "It has been a rare and welcome gift." Alara curtsied once more, unable to find adequate words to respond, and climbed into the carriage, with her mind spinning faster than the wheels beneath her. As the carriage pulled away from Ashworth Hall, she looked back once, toward the tall windows of the sitting room, where she had spoken more honestly with a stranger than she had spoken with almost anyone else in her life, and she wondered, with a mixture of hope and fear she did not fully understand, what exactly she had just set into motion. She did not know that behind those same windows, Julian Ashworth stood watching her carriage disappear down the long drive, already dreading the 6 remaining audiences he had scheduled for the days ahead, each one feeling now like a formality he was only enduring, rather than a search he still believed in. The remaining audiences unfolded over the following 2 weeks, each one carefully arranged by Mr. Pemberton, each one leaving Julian more convinced that his father's list, however practical in its reasoning, had failed to account for the one quality he found himself valuing above all others. Lady Ophelia Grantham arrived in a gown so elaborate it seemed designed more for a coronation than a private morning meeting. She spoke at length about her family's estates in the north, her fluency in French and Italian, and her belief that a duchess should be seen at every important social gathering in London during the season. When Julian asked her, almost as an afterthought, what she thought of his father's illness and the pressure it placed upon this decision, she offered only a brief expression of sympathy, before returning quickly to a description of the gowns she intended to commission, should she become his wife. Miss Lucinda Hartley proved sharper in conversation, quick with clever remarks about politics and trade that Julian found genuinely engaging for the better part of their meeting. Yet even her wit felt calculated, each remark measured for its effect, rather than offered freely, and when he mentioned his father's failing health, she pivoted the conversation smoothly toward her own family's shipping success, as though grief were simply an inconvenient topic to be steered around, rather than acknowledged. Miss Vivian Ashcombe played the piano beautifully in the parlor before their conversation even began, a performance clearly designed to impress, rather than an offering of genuine feeling. Her fingers moved across the keys with technical precision, but Julian found his attention wandering, comparing the polished performance unfavorably to the quiet, unrehearsed honesty he had encountered in a much smaller room 2 weeks earlier. Each audience passed in similar fashion, one candidate after another presenting her most impressive qualities, like items laid out for inspection at a market stall. They were beautiful. They were accomplished. They were exactly the kind of women his father's list had promised, wealthy and well-connected, and prepared to become duchesses without a moment of hesitation. None of them asked him how he was managing his father's illness. None of them seemed to consider, even briefly, that the man across from them might be exhausted, grieving, and frightened of a future that felt increasingly like a burden rather than a privilege. "You have grown quiet these past days, Your Grace," Pemberton observed one evening, as they reviewed the notes from that day's audience together in the study. "I had expected you to show more enthusiasm by now. Several of these young women would make excellent matches by any reasonable measure." "Reasonable by what measure?" Julian asked, staring into the fire, rather than at the papers spread across the desk before him. "Wealth, connection, reputation," Pemberton answered, as though the categories were self-evident. "Everything a marriage of this importance requires." "And what of understanding?" Julian said quietly. "What of a woman who does not require a performance to feel valued, who does not need silk and jewels to prove her worth in a conversation? Does that measure appear anywhere on your list, Pemberton?" Pemberton hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond to a question that fell so far outside the practical framework he had built his entire career upon. "I confess I do not believe such qualities can be easily measured on paper, Your Grace." "No," Julian agreed, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "I do not believe they can." He thought often, in the quiet hours after each audience concluded, of the conversation he had shared with Elara Whitmore in the sitting room at the back of the house. He thought of her honest confession that she did not wish to be chosen out of pity, of the quiet dignity with which she had spoken about her family's misfortune without asking for sympathy, of the way she had understood, without needing an explanation, exactly what it meant to make difficult choices out of duty rather than desire. He found himself wondering what she was doing in the evenings, whether she thought of their conversation as often as he found himself returning to it, whether the strange, unexpected warmth he had felt in her presence had been a fleeting reaction to an unusual encounter, or something that might, given time and opportunity, grow into something far more lasting. Meanwhile, in the Whitmore household, the mood had shifted in ways that left Elara feeling increasingly uncertain of her place within her own family. "You spoke with him for nearly an hour," Beatrice said one evening at dinner, studying her younger sister, with an expression that mixed curiosity with something Elara could not quite identify. "None of the other candidates were granted more than 30 minutes, according to what I have heard from Lady Grantham's household staff. I do not know why our conversation lasted as long as it did," Elara said honestly, pushing the food around her plate without much appetite. "We simply spoke about books and roads and other unremarkable things." "Nothing about a duke's private audience is unremarkable," her mother interjected sharply, though there was a new note in her voice, something almost hopeful beneath the sharpness. "Perhaps we have all underestimated your chances in this matter, Elara. Perhaps there is more value in your circumstances than we previously believed." Elara said nothing to that, uncertain how to explain that whatever connection she had felt with the Duke had nothing to do with value in the way her mother understood the word. It had felt, instead, like being seen clearly for the first time in years, not as a burden or an afterthought, but as a person whose thoughts and honesty mattered to someone else. She did not allow herself to hope too deeply, however. She had learned long ago that hope, left unchecked, tended to lead only to disappointment, and she suspected that whatever brief connection she had shared with Julian Ashworth would ultimately mean very little once he had finished his audiences with 6 other women, each one more suited to his position than she could ever claim to be. It was nearly 3 weeks after her audience when a letter arrived at the Whitmore household, sealed with the familiar crest of Ashworth Hall. Ilara's hands trembled as she broke the seal, her mother and sisters gathering close behind her, all 3 of them holding their breath as she unfolded the paper and read the words written in careful, formal handwriting. The Duke of Ashworth requested the pleasure of her company for a private walk through the gardens of Ashworth Hall the following Sunday afternoon. A private walk, her mother breathed, pressing a hand to her chest as though she might faint from the shock of it. Ilara, do you understand what this means? A private walk is not simply another audience. It is a courtship. Ilara read the letter 3 more times, searching for some hidden meaning that would explain why, after audiences with 6 women far more suited to his position, the Duke of Ashworth had chosen to extend such an invitation to her instead. She found no answer within the careful, formal words, only the simple fact that he had asked, and that some quiet, hopeful part of her heart, the part she had tried so hard to keep guarded against disappointment, had already begun to believe that perhaps, against every reasonable expectation, she might actually have a chance. What will people say? Clara wondered aloud, though there was no cruelty in the question now, only genuine curiosity about a situation that had surprised all of them equally. The other families will not be pleased to learn he has chosen to walk privately with you, instead of extending the same invitation to their daughters. I do not know what people will say, Ilara admitted, folding the letter carefully and pressing it against her chest, the way she had done with the first letter, weeks earlier. But I find, for the first time, in a very long while, that I am less concerned with what people will say, and more curious about what he intends to say to me. That admission surprised her more than anyone else in the room, and as she excused herself to prepare for the Sunday walk that felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close, she wondered when exactly she had stopped bracing herself for disappointment and started, quietly and against her better judgment, to hope. The gardens of Ashworth Hall stretched wide and green beneath a soft afternoon sun, rows of carefully trimmed hedges leading toward a fountain that had stood at the center of the estate for nearly a century. Ilara walked slowly beside Julian along the gravel path, her gloved hand resting lightly on his offered arm, both of them silent for the first several minutes, as though neither quite knew how to begin a conversation that felt far more significant than the polite exchanges of their first meeting. I owe you an explanation, Julian said finally, breaking the silence as they approached the fountain, for why I invited you here today, when 6 other women of far greater consequence have already completed their audiences with me. I confess I have wondered, Ilara admitted, watching the water catch the sunlight as it fell in gentle arcs from the fountain's center. Though I did not wish to presume any particular reason. None of them asked how I was managing my father's illness, Julian said quietly, his gaze fixed on the water rather than on her. Not one of them, in the entire course of our conversations, thought to ask whether I was frightened, or exhausted, or grieving a man who has not yet died, but whom I am already beginning to lose piece by piece each day. You did not ask either, but you understood, without needing to ask. That difference has stayed with me since the day we spoke. Ilara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. I understand grief better than most young women my age, Your Grace, she said softly. My father did not die, but the version of him that existed before his investments failed did, in many ways. I watched my mother mourn the loss of security and comfort, even while my father remained alive and present in our home. I learned early that grief does not always require a death to be real. You speak of these things so plainly, Julian said, turning to study her face with the same intense curiosity she remembered from their first conversation. Most people guard their family's hardships as though revealing them were a shameful secret. Perhaps I have simply grown tired of pretending, Ilara replied. Pretending my family is wealthier than we are. pretending I am content being overlooked while my sisters are celebrated, pretending the ache of being called the last option, the afterthought, does not sting as much as it truly does. The words left her before she could stop them, more honest than she had intended to be, and she felt her cheeks warm with sudden embarrassment at having revealed so much of the quiet pain she usually kept carefully hidden beneath a composed exterior. Julian stopped walking entirely, turning to face her directly. "Who has called you that?" he asked, and there was an edge to his voice now, sharp and protective in a way that startled her. "The last option. Who has said such a thing to you?" "No one has needed to say it aloud, Your Grace," Alara said quietly. "It has simply always been understood. My sisters are the beautiful ones, the accomplished ones, the daughters expected to save this family through advantageous marriages. I am the daughter included in invitations, only so our family does not appear incomplete. I made peace with that role a long time ago." "You should not have needed to make peace with such a role," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. "You are not an afterthought, Miss Whitmore. In the weeks since our first conversation, I have sat across from 6 women whose wealth and connections would satisfy every practical requirement my father's list demanded, and not one of them has occupied my thoughts the way you have." Alara's breath caught in her throat, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. "Your Grace, I do not wish you to say such things simply out of kindness, or because you feel some obligation toward sympathy. I am not a man who says things out of obligation," Julian interrupted gently, though firmly. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me precisely what they believe I wish to hear, in the hope of gaining my favor or my fortune. You are the first person, in a very long while, who has told me the truth, without any expectation of gain, even when that truth was unflattering to your own circumstances. That honesty is rare, Miss Whitmore, and I have come to value it more than I expected." They resumed walking slowly along the garden path, the silence between them now comfortable rather than uncertain, and Alara found herself sharing more of her family's history than she had ever shared with anyone outside her immediate household. She spoke of her father's investments in a shipping venture that had seemed promising until a storm destroyed 3 vessels within the same season, of the slow, painful process of watching their household staff diminish year by year as expenses had to be cut, of her mother's careful management of appearances despite the growing weight of debt pressing down upon the family. Julian listened without interruption, occasionally asking a question that showed he was truly absorbing what she shared, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. In return, he spoke more openly than he had with anyone in years about the pressure of his position, the weight of his father's expectations, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who valued his title far more than they valued him as a person. "I was engaged once before," he admitted quietly, as they reached a quiet bench beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the garden. "Several years ago, to a woman named Constance. I believed for a time that she cared for me. I learned eventually that her affection had been calculated from the very beginning, designed to secure a fortune rather than a genuine partnership. When my father's health first began to decline, and it became clear the estate faced certain complications regarding inheritance, she ended the engagement within a matter of weeks." "I am sorry," Alara said softly, understanding now the source of the guarded distance she had witnessed in him during the ball, the careful walls he had built around himself in the years since. "I do not tell you this for sympathy," Julian said, meeting her eyes directly. "I tell you this because I want you to understand why the honesty you have shown me matters so deeply. I have learned to distrust affection that comes too easily, too quickly, too conveniently aligned with my fortune and my title. What I have felt in your presence these past weeks has felt entirely different from anything I experienced with Constance. It has felt real." Alara sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his words, her heart pounding, with a mixture of hope and fear, so intertwined she could not separate one from the other. "Your Grace," she said finally, choosing her words with great care, "I must be honest with you about my own fears in this matter. If you were to choose me over women of far greater wealth and connection, I worry deeply about what society would say, about whether they would believe you had settled for the last option simply because you pitied my family's circumstances, or because some strange sense of obligation compelled you toward kindness rather than genuine affection." "Let them say what they wish," Julian replied, his voice carrying a quiet firmness that surprised her. I have spent my entire life allowing society's expectations to dictate my choices. My father's illness has taught me, painfully, that time is far too precious to waste on decisions made purely to satisfy the opinions of people who will forget their objections within a single season. I do not intend to choose a wife based on what will please the gossiping tongues of the ton. I intend to choose based on what I believe will bring genuine partnership and understanding into a life that has, until recently, felt remarkably lonely. The words settled over Alara like warm sunlight breaking through clouds she had not realized were pressing so heavily upon her heart. She did not know, in that quiet moment beneath the oak tree, whether to believe fully in the hope blossoming within her chest, or whether to guard herself carefully against a disappointment she feared might still be waiting somewhere ahead. But as Julian reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own, she allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe that perhaps her life was beginning to change in ways she had never dared to imagine possible. Neither of them noticed, as they sat together beneath the oak tree, a figure watching quietly from an upstairs window of Ashworth Hall, her expression sharp with calculation rather than warmth. Lady Ophelia Grantham had come to deliver a message to Mr. Pemberton regarding her family's continued interest in the match, and what she witnessed through that window, a private moment of tenderness between the Duke and a woman she considered far beneath her own standing, settled into her mind with the cold, careful precision of a woman already planning how best to ensure such a match would never come to pass. News of the private garden walk spread through the county within a matter of days, carried from household to household by servants who had overheard fragments of conversation, by messengers who noticed how long Alara's carriage had remained parked outside Ashworth Hall, by the simple, unstoppable momentum of gossip once it had been given even the smallest thread to follow. By the time Alara attended a smaller gathering hosted by Lady Grantham the following week, the whispers had already grown into something far sharper than simple curiosity. "I hear the Duke walked with her for nearly 2 hours," one woman murmured to another, as Alara passed near a cluster of guests gathered by the refreshment table, neither of them bothering to lower their voices enough to avoid being overheard. 2 hours, with a woman whose family cannot even afford to replace their carriage wheels. "Pity, I imagine," the second woman replied, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "The Duke has always had a soft heart beneath that cold exterior. Perhaps he simply felt sorry for her circumstances and wished to offer a kindness before selecting a proper match." Alara kept her chin lifted and her expression composed, though the words struck deeper than she wished to admit. She had feared exactly this reaction, had voiced her worry to Julian himself beneath the oak tree, and hearing the whispers, confirmed aloud, felt like watching a private fear step into the light and grow teeth. "Do not let them see it bother you," Beatrice whispered, appearing suddenly at her sister's side, her expression uncharacteristically protective. "They are only jealous, Alara. Whatever their reasons, the Duke chose to spend 2 hours with you, when he did not extend the same courtesy to any of the others." "Perhaps that is precisely the problem," Alara murmured back. "Perhaps everyone believes there must be some hidden explanation, some reason beyond genuine interest, because the alternative, that he might simply prefer my company, seems impossible to them." Across the room, Lady Ophelia Grantham watched the exchange with sharp, calculating eyes, a small smile curving her lips as she turned to whisper something to the woman standing beside her. Alara did not hear the words exchanged, but she felt the weight of Ophelia's attention settle over her like a cold shadow, and something instinctive within her recognized danger long before she understood its shape. The rumors grew worse over the following days. Whispers began to circulate that the Whitmore family's debts were far more severe than previously believed, that Alara's father had been involved in questionable business dealings, that the family had deliberately orchestrated the entire encounter at the ball to trap the Duke into an obligation he would come to regret. None of these rumors held any truth, but truth mattered little once gossip had gathered enough momentum to carry itself forward on its own strength. "I do not know where these stories are coming from," Lady Margaret said one evening, her hands trembling as she folded a letter from a distant cousin who had written to ask, with poorly disguised concern, whether the family's circumstances were truly as dire as rumor suggested. "Someone is deliberately spreading these lies, Alara. This is not simple gossip born from jealousy. This feels calculated." Alara suspected her mother was right, though she had no proof to offer, only the memory of Ophelia Grantham's cold, satisfied smile at the gathering the previous week. She said nothing of her suspicion, unwilling to accuse another woman without evidence, though the worry settled uneasily in her chest regardless. The situation grew worse still, when a particularly cruel rumor began circulating that suggested Alara had once been involved in an inappropriate arrangement with a merchant's son from a neighboring county. A complete fabrication designed to cast doubt on her character and suitability as a potential duchess. By the time the rumor reached Alara's own ears, it had already traveled through half the county's drawing rooms, growing more elaborate and damaging with each retelling. "This is not simply gossip about wealth or family standing," Alara said to her sisters one evening, her voice tight with a fear she could no longer fully hide. "Someone is deliberately attempting to destroy my reputation entirely. If these rumors reach the Duke, or worse, reach his father, they could ruin any chance I might have had, regardless of what genuine feeling exists between us." "You must tell him," Clara urged, gripping her sister's hand, "before the rumors reach him through someone else's twisted account. Tell him the truth yourself, before it is too late." But pride and fear held Alara back in the days that followed. She feared that approaching Julian directly with such accusations would appear desperate, as though she were trying to secure his affection through manipulation, rather than allowing genuine feeling to develop naturally. She feared, too, a deeper and more painful possibility, that perhaps he would hear the rumors and believe them regardless of anything she said in her own defense, that perhaps the fairy tale beginning to bloom between them was simply too fragile to survive the weight of society's cruelty. It was during this difficult week that a letter arrived from Ashworth Hall, requesting Alara's presence for another private meeting, this time with a note indicating the matter was one of some urgency. Alara's stomach twisted with dread as she read the words. She feared, with a certainty that felt almost like grief settling into her chest before the loss had even occurred, that Julian had heard the rumors already, and that this meeting would mark not the continuation of their courtship, but its abrupt and painful end. She arrived at Ashworth Hall the following afternoon, with her heart heavy with anticipated disappointment, prepared to hear him explain, with the same gentle courtesy he had shown her from the very beginning, that circumstances had changed, and their acquaintance could not continue further. Instead, she found him waiting in the same small sitting room where their first private conversation had taken place, his expression tight with an anger she had not seen in him before, though she quickly understood the anger was not directed toward her. "I have heard the rumors circulating about your family," he said without preamble, rising to meet her as she entered the room. "About your character, about a fabricated involvement with a merchant's son, that I have already confirmed to be entirely false. Your Grace, I did not know how to approach you about this without appearing." "You need not explain yourself to me," Julian interrupted gently, his anger softening as he looked at her, replaced by something that looked almost like tenderness, mixed with fierce protectiveness. "I have already begun making inquiries into the source of these rumors, and I have reason to believe they did not originate by accident." Alara felt a chill pass through her at his words, her earlier suspicion regarding Lady Ophelia Grantham surfacing again, though she still hesitated to voice such an accusation aloud without proof. "Whatever the source," Julian continued, his voice firm with a conviction that steadied something trembling within Alara's chest, "I want you to understand clearly that these rumors have not changed my regard for you in the slightest. If anything, they have only strengthened my resolve. I do not intend to allow petty jealousy and cruel gossip to dictate the course of my life, particularly not when the target of such cruelty is a woman I have come to admire more deeply with every conversation we share." "You truly believe me?" Alara whispered, relief flooding through her so suddenly that she felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I believe you completely," Julian said, stepping closer and taking her hands gently within his own. "And I intend to make certain that whoever is responsible for spreading these lies understands very clearly that such tactics will not succeed in driving you away from my consideration." Alara looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt or hesitation, and finding none, allowed herself finally to release the fear she had carried since the rumors first began circulating through the county's drawing rooms. But even as relief washed through her, a quiet unease remained settled at the back of her mind. If someone had gone to such lengths to fabricate an entire scandal, someone determined and resourceful enough to spread convincing lies across an entire county within a matter of days, Alara understood with a sinking certainty that this would not be the last attempt to destroy the fragile happiness beginning to grow between them. Mr. Pemberton stood rigidly before Julian's desk the following morning, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had rehearsed his words before speaking them aloud. "Your Grace, I must speak plainly regarding the matter of Miss Whitmore," he began, his voice steady, despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "I understand you have grown fond of her these past weeks, but I must remind you of the practical realities your father's list was designed to address. This family requires stability, connection, and resources to secure its future for the next generation. Miss Whitmore, however admirable her character may be, brings none of these advantages to a marriage." "I have heard this argument from you before, Pemberton," Julian said, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested his patience for the conversation had already worn thin. "I do not intend to hear it again. Your father specifically requested a match built on practical considerations," Pemberton pressed, undeterred. "He is not long for this world, Your Grace, and I do not believe he would approve of a decision made in haste, based on sentiment rather than sound judgment." "My father," Julian said, rising from behind his desk with a controlled anger that made Pemberton take an involuntary step backward, "asked me to choose a woman who would not embarrass this family, a woman capable of steady partnership, rather than empty ambition. He did not specify that wealth or connection must be the deciding factor. He trusted me to make this decision, using my own judgment, and I have made it." "You intend to choose her then," Pemberton said, though it was clear from his tone that he had already suspected as much, and was simply seeking final confirmation before preparing the necessary arrangements. "I intend to court her properly, and if she will have me, I intend to marry her," Julian said firmly. "I understand this decision will invite criticism from every corner of society. I have made peace with that reality. What I will not accept, Pemberton, is continued resistance from within my own household regarding a choice I have already made, with full clarity of mind." Pemberton studied his employer for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted slightly, the rigid disapproval softening just slightly into something closer to reluctant respect. "Very well, Your Grace. I will prepare the necessary arrangements to formalize your intentions. Though I must ask, given the rumors that have already begun circulating, how do you intend to address the concerns that will inevitably arise regarding Miss Whitmore's family circumstances and the fabricated scandal already spreading through the county?" "I intend to address them directly and publicly," Julian said, a new resolve settling firmly across his features. "I will not allow whispered lies to shape the narrative surrounding this decision. If society wishes to judge Miss Whitmore, they will do so with the full truth before them, not the twisted fabrications someone has deliberately spread to undermine her character." That evening, Julian visited his father's chamber once more, finding the old Duke propped up against a mountain of pillows, his breathing labored, but his mind still sharp, despite his weakening body. "I have made my decision," Julian said, settling into the familiar chair beside the bed. "I intend to marry Alara Whitmore." His father studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "The daughter with no dowry," he said finally, his voice carrying neither approval nor immediate condemnation, simply careful consideration. "Tell me why, Julian. Tell me why you have chosen her over 6 other women who could bring far more practical advantage to this family." Julian considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that his father deserved an honest explanation rather than a hasty justification. "Because she has never once tried to convince me of her worth through flattery or performance," he said slowly. "Because she understands grief and duty in ways the others could not, having lived through genuine hardship rather than simply hearing stories of it. Because when I am with her, I do not feel like a title to be won or a fortune to be secured. I feel, for the first time since Constance, like a man who might actually be understood by the woman he chooses to marry." His father was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting against the blankets, his eyes fixed on some distant point Julian could not identify. "Your mother," he said finally, his voice softer than Julian had heard it in months, "was chosen for practical reasons, much like the ones I demanded of you. We built a respectful partnership, your mother and I. But respect and genuine understanding are not always the same thing. I have often wondered, in the quiet hours of these past months, whether our marriage might have held more warmth had different considerations guided its formation." "Father, let me finish," the old Duke said, lifting a trembling hand slightly to silence his son's interruption. "I asked you to choose steadiness, Julian, because I feared watching this family fall into ruin through poor judgment or wasted sentiment. But steadiness and genuine connection need not be opposing qualities. If this young woman possesses the character you describe, if she understands duty as deeply as you claim, then perhaps she offers exactly the steadiness I hoped for, simply wrapped in a form I did not anticipate." Relief washed through Julian at his father's words, though he remained cautious, aware that approval in principle did not guarantee approval once his father learned of the rumors already circulating regarding Alara's reputation. "There is something else you should know," Julian continued carefully. "Someone has begun spreading false rumors about Miss Whitmore's character, fabrications designed, I believe, to discourage this match before it can be formalized." His father's expression hardened slightly, the old sharpness that had built an empire flickering briefly behind his tired eyes. "Do you know who is responsible?" "I suspect Lady Ophelia Grantham," Julian admitted, "though I have no definitive proof as of yet." "Then obtain proof," his father said, his voice carrying a flash of the commanding authority he had once wielded so effortlessly. "I did not survive 4 decades of business dealings and political maneuvering without learning how to expose those who operate through deception rather than honest competition. If this Grantham woman has spread lies to secure an advantage for herself, she will not succeed in doing so unchallenged, not while I still draw breath in this house." Julian left his father's chamber that night with a renewed sense of purpose, understanding now that he carried not only his own conviction, but his father's blessing as well, however cautiously it had been extended. He resolved, walking through the quiet halls of Ashworth Hall toward his own chambers, that he would uncover the truth behind the rumors plaguing Alara's reputation, and that he would ensure, whatever the cost to his own comfort or convenience, that the woman he had come to care for so deeply would not suffer for the crime of simply being chosen. He did not yet know how difficult that promise would prove to keep, nor how close Alara herself had already come to abandoning their courtship entirely, believing that the growing weight of scandal made any future between them impossible to sustain. The rumors reached a breaking point 3 days later, when a letter arrived at the Whitmore household from a family friend in a neighboring county, warning Lady Margaret that the fabricated scandal regarding Alara's supposed inappropriate arrangement had grown so elaborate that some now claimed she had borne a secret child from the encounter, an accusation so absurd and so cruel that Alara felt physically ill upon hearing it read aloud. "This cannot continue," her mother said, her hands shaking as she set the letter down upon the table. "Alara, I fear this scandal has grown beyond anything we can control. Perhaps it would be wiser to withdraw from the Duke's consideration entirely, before matters grow worse still." "Withdraw," Alara repeated, though even as she said the word, a part of her recognized the strange relief hidden within it, the possibility of escaping this mounting pressure by simply stepping away before the humiliation could grow any deeper. "I do not say this lightly," her mother continued, her voice heavy with genuine concern rather than her usual practical calculation. "But I have watched you grow more troubled with each passing day, and I fear the cost of pursuing this match may prove greater than any benefit it might bring, regardless of how the Duke himself feels toward you." That night, alone in her bedchamber, Alara sat by the window for a long while, staring out at the darkened countryside, wrestling with a decision that felt far heavier than any she had faced before. She thought of Julian's steady reassurance in the sitting room days earlier, his conviction that the rumors would not change his regard for her. But she also thought of the exhausting weight of being watched and whispered about everywhere she went, of the fear that even if she and Julian married, the scandal might follow her for the rest of her life, coloring every interaction, every gathering, every quiet moment, meant to be private and free from judgment. She began composing a letter that evening, her hand trembling as she wrote words she never truly wished to send, a careful explanation to Julian that perhaps it would be best if they ended their courtship now, before either of their reputations suffered further damage from a scandal neither of them had caused, but both of them were now forced to endure. She did not finish the letter that night, setting it aside unfinished on her desk, uncertain whether she possessed the courage to send it, or the courage to continue forward, despite everything working against them. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Whitmore household. Julian arrived unannounced, his expression carrying a determined intensity that Alara had not seen in him before, and he requested a private word with her the moment he stepped through the door. "I know what the rumors have grown into," he said, the moment they were alone in the small parlor, his voice tight, with barely contained anger. "I know the cruelty being spread about you, and I want you to understand something clearly before you consider any decision regarding our courtship." Alara's heart pounded, uncertain whether he had come to end things himself or to offer the reassurance she desperately needed, but feared did not truly exist. "I have found proof," Julian continued, reaching into his coat and producing a folded letter. "Proof that Lady Ophelia Grantham has been paying a servant within this very household to spread false information, embellishing each rumor further with every telling, in an attempt to discourage this match and secure my attention for herself instead." Alara stared at the letter in disbelief, her hands trembling as she took it from him, and read the confession written in a servant's careful, apologetic hand, admitting to receiving payment from Lady Grantham to fabricate and circulate the cruel stories that had caused so much pain over the past several weeks. "She did this," Alara whispered, relief and anger warring within her chest in equal measure. "All of it, simply because she wished to secure your attention for herself?" "It appears so," Julian said grimly. "I confronted her this morning, with this confession in hand, and she did not deny it, once faced with undeniable proof. She has already been informed that her family will no longer be welcome at any future gathering hosted by Ashworth Hall, and I intend to ensure the truth reaches every household that has heard these fabricated rumors, so that your reputation may be restored fully and completely." Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they came from relief rather than despair. "I began writing a letter last night," she admitted quietly, unable to hide the truth from him, now that the weight pressing upon her heart had finally begun to lift. "A letter asking to end our courtship, believing the scandal had grown too large for either of us to overcome." Julian's expression softened with understanding, rather than hurt, at her confession. "I do not blame you for considering it," he said gently. "The weight you have carried these past weeks would have tested anyone's resolve, but I want you to know, Alara, that I never once considered stepping away, not for a single moment. Whatever society believes, whatever lies have been spread, my regard for you has never wavered." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than the formal address of Miss Whitmore, and something in the simple intimacy of it settled deep into her chest, warming places that fear and exhaustion had left cold over the previous difficult weeks. "Julian," she said softly, testing the sound of his name upon her own lips for the first time. "Thank you. For believing me, and for fighting for the truth when it would have been far easier to simply let the rumors run their course. I will always fight for you," he said, taking her hands within his own with a gentle firmness that left no room for doubt. "I have watched this county mock you, dismiss you, call you the last option, as though you were somehow less deserving of happiness than any other woman in attendance at that ball weeks ago. I intend to prove to every single person who has ever underestimated you exactly how wrong they truly were." Alara felt something within her chest that had remained guarded and cautious for years finally begin to unfold, a fragile but growing trust that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who saw her clearly and valued her completely. Scandal and circumstance be damned. Within the week, word spread through the county of the servant's confession and Lady Ophelia Grantham's role in orchestrating the cruel fabrications against Alara's character. The same drawing rooms that had once whispered scandalous rumors now buzzed with a different kind of gossip entirely, one that painted Alara not as a woman unworthy of consideration, but as a woman who had endured cruel injustice with quiet dignity, ultimately vindicated by the Duke's unwavering support. Alara found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she cared far less about society's shifting opinion than she once might have expected. What mattered far more was the steady warmth in Julian's eyes each time he looked at her now, the growing certainty in her own heart that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The formal announcement of the engagement was made 3 weeks later, during a gathering hosted at Ashworth Hall specifically for that purpose. Alara stood beside Julian at the top of the same grand staircase where she had first watched him descend into the ballroom months earlier, her hand resting securely within his own, her heart steady, despite the sea of curious faces gathered below them. "Are you nervous?" Julian asked quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear his words above the murmur of the crowd. Terrified, Elara admitted with a small smile, though far less terrified than I once believed I would be, standing here beside you. The old Duke had insisted on being present for the announcement, despite his physician's concerns, seated in a specially arranged chair near the base of the staircase, his frail form wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. When Julian had introduced Elara to his father for the first time the previous week, the old man had studied her with the same careful, assessing gaze Julian himself often carried, before finally nodding slowly, a rare gesture of approval that had brought quiet tears to Elara's eyes. "You understand duty," the old Duke had said then, echoing words Elara had once spoken to Julian in a much smaller room. "And more than that, I believe you understand my son. That is worth more than any dowry could ever provide." Now, as Julian led her down the staircase together, Elara caught sight of her mother standing near the front of the gathered crowd, tears streaming freely down her face, her expression a complicated mixture of pride and disbelief at the transformation her youngest daughter's circumstances had undergone in such a short span of time. Beatrice and Clara stood beside their mother, both sisters smiling with a genuine warmth that held none of the dismissive pity Elara had grown accustomed to receiving from them in years past. "I never believed this day would come," Beatrice whispered, as Elara passed close by during the reception that followed the announcement. "I am sorry, Elara, for every time I made you feel as though you did not matter, as much as Clara and myself. You deserved better, from your own sisters." "You did not know any better," Elara replied gently, squeezing her sister's hand. "None of us did. We simply believed the roles society assigned to each of us, without ever questioning whether those roles were fair or accurate." Across the room, she caught sight of familiar faces from the original ball, women who had once dismissed her presence entirely, now approaching with careful, curious smiles, eager to establish themselves as acquaintances of the future Duchess of Ashworth. Elara greeted each of them with polite courtesy, though she found herself, for the first time in her life, entirely unmoved by their sudden interest, understanding clearly now that their regard had shifted, not because they had come to know her character more deeply, but because her circumstances had simply changed in ways that made her suddenly valuable in their eyes. Lady Ophelia Grantham was notably absent from the gathering, her family having quietly withdrawn from county society altogether following the exposure of her scheme against Elara's reputation. Elara felt no satisfaction in the woman's downfall, only a quiet relief that the cruelty she had endured had finally been recognized for what it truly was, and that the truth, however delayed, had ultimately prevailed. "You are handling all of this remarkably well," Julian observed later that evening, as they found a quiet moment alone, on a small balcony, overlooking the gardens where they had shared their first honest conversation weeks earlier. "I half expected the sudden attention to overwhelm you." "I have spent my entire life being overlooked," Elara said softly, leaning against the balcony railing, as she watched the moonlight play across the same fountain where he had first spoken to her about his father's illness. "I find, now that the opposite has occurred, that I understand something important about all of it. The attention itself was never truly what I wanted. What I wanted, what I believe I have finally found, was simply to be seen and valued for who I actually am, rather than for what I could provide or how I could be useful to someone else's ambitions." Julian turned to face her fully, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair back from her face, his expression carrying a tenderness that had grown steadily more open and unguarded with each passing week of their courtship. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who valued my title above all else," he said quietly. "I understand precisely what you mean, perhaps more deeply than most men in my position ever will." "We understand each other," Elara said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "That is more than I ever expected to find in a marriage, Julian. That is more than I ever believed I deserved." "You have always deserved exactly this," Julian said firmly, "and far more besides. I only regret that it took society so long and cost you so much unnecessary pain before the truth of your worth became clear to everyone around us." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the moon rise higher above the gardens, both of them aware that the wedding itself, still weeks away, would bring its own set of challenges and adjustments, as Elara prepared to step fully into a role society had once believed entirely beyond her reach. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elara faced the future, without the familiar weight of dread and resignation that had shadowed her for so many years. She faced it instead with quiet, steady hope, standing beside a man who had chosen her not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine understanding and growing affection that had blossomed, against every expectation, from a single accident with a spilled glass of wine. Behind them, inside the warmly lit halls of Ashworth Hall, the old Duke watched his son, and the woman he had chosen, through a nearby window, a faint, contented smile settling across his tired features. Whatever time remained to him now felt lighter somehow, knowing that his family's future rested not merely in capable hands, but in hands guided by genuine understanding and steady devotion, exactly the qualities he had hoped for, but never truly expected his son would find. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, sunlight spilling generously across the grounds of Ashworth Hall as servants moved briskly about final preparations, arranging flowers along the chapel aisle, and setting long tables in the great hall for the celebration that would follow the ceremony itself. Alara stood before the tall mirror in what had once been a guest chamber, but now served as her private preparation room, watching as the housekeeper carefully fastened the final pearl buttons along the back of her wedding gown. The dress was nothing like the borrowed, altered gowns she had worn to previous gatherings. This one had been made specifically for her, commissioned weeks earlier by Julian himself, who had insisted that she deserved something entirely her own for this particular day. "You look beautiful," her mother said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion as she stepped into the room. "I only wish your father could see you now." Alara's father had passed away from a sudden illness 2 years earlier, before the family's fortunes had fully collapsed, and Alara felt a familiar ache of loss mixed with the joy of the present moment. "I believe he can see, in whatever way such things are possible," she said softly. "I believe he would be proud of the woman I have become, even through all the difficulty these past years have brought." "He would be more than proud," her mother said, crossing the room to take her daughter's hands gently within her own. "Alara, I owe you an apology. I should have offered long before this day arrived. I spent years treating you as though you mattered less than your sisters, as though your worth depended entirely on what you could bring to this family through marriage. I was wrong to make you feel that way, and I am deeply sorry for the pain that belief must have caused you." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes, though she blinked them back carefully, unwilling to ruin the careful work the housekeeper had done on her appearance that morning.
"Thank you, Mother,"
she said softly. "I understand now that you were simply frightened, doing whatever you believed necessary to protect this family, during an impossibly difficult time. I do not hold it against you any longer." Beatrice and Clara entered the room shortly after, both dressed in matching gowns of pale blue, their expressions warm with genuine affection, as they helped adjust the final details of Alara's appearance before the ceremony began. "I never imagined I would stand here helping you prepare for a wedding to a duke," Clara admitted with a small, teasing smile, though her eyes carried genuine warmth rather than any lingering jealousy. "Though I confess, watching everything that has happened these past months, I have come to believe you deserve this happiness more than any of us ever realized." "We all deserve happiness," Alara said gently. "I simply happened to find mine in a place none of us expected to look." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of quiet joy, the small chapel on the Ashworth estate filled with guests who had, over the previous months, come to see Alara not as the family's forgotten daughter, but as a woman whose quiet strength and genuine character had ultimately proven far more valuable than any dowry or social connection could have provided. The old Duke sat in the front row, his health having stabilized somewhat in recent weeks, as though the joy of witnessing his son's happiness had granted him a measure of renewed strength. When Julian turned to face her at the altar, his expression carrying none of the guarded coldness that had once defined his reputation throughout the county, Alara felt the full weight of how far they had both traveled since that first accidental encounter by the refreshment table months earlier. "I promise to see you clearly, every single day of our life together," Julian said, during the exchange of vows, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes. "I promise never to let the opinions of others diminish the value I have come to place in your honesty, your understanding, and your unwavering character. You were never the last option, Alara. You have always been, and will always remain, my only choice." Alara felt tears finally escape, despite her earlier efforts to hold them back, though she did not mind, understanding that some moments of joy were simply too large to contain within careful composure. "I promise to understand you fully," she replied, her voice steady and clear despite the emotion filling her chest. Not as a title or a duty, but as the man I have come to know and love these past months. I promise to remind you, whenever the world grows heavy with expectation, that you are valued for who you are, not simply for what you can provide. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music and laughter that echoed through halls that had, until recently, felt cold and guarded under Julian's careful, distant management. Guests who had once doubted the wisdom of this match now raised their glasses freely in genuine celebration, having witnessed over the previous months exactly how deeply devoted the Duke and his new Duchess had become to one another. Late in the evening, as the celebration began to wind down and guests slowly departed toward their carriages, Elara found herself standing once more on the same balcony where she and Julian had shared their quiet conversation weeks earlier, now wearing her wedding gown instead of the modest dress she had worn that evening. "Do you remember," Julian asked, joining her at the railing, "the exact moment you realized you might actually care for me?" Elara considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe it was the moment you asked whether being chosen out of pity would trouble me," she said finally. "No one had ever asked me such a direct question before, treating my feelings as though they genuinely mattered, rather than being an afterthought to more practical considerations. What of you?" "The moment you told me the wine stain would ruin my coat," Julian said with a small, genuine laugh, the first truly carefree sound Elara had heard from him in all their months together. "I believe some part of me recognized, even then, that I had found someone entirely different from anyone I had encountered before, someone who spoke to me as a person, rather than a position." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the last of the evening's guests depart down the long drive leading away from Ashworth Hall, the moonlight casting a gentle silver glow across the gardens below them. "Everyone called you the last option," Julian said softly, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying nothing but quiet certainty and deep affection. "They were wrong, Elara. They were wrong about everything that truly matters." "And you," Elara replied, reaching up to gently touch his face, "chose me as your only bride, not because circumstance forced your hand, but because you saw something in me that everyone else had overlooked for years. I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never doubt that choice," Julian said, drawing her close beneath the quiet night sky. "You were never anyone's last option, Elara. You were always, from that very first accidental meeting, exactly the woman I did not yet know I was searching for." As the last carriage disappeared down the drive and the halls of Ashworth Hall settled into peaceful quiet around them, Elara allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe in the happiness she had found. The girl once dismissed as an afterthought, the daughter called the last option by a world too quick to judge based on wealth and appearance alone, had found in the most unexpected of circumstances a partnership built not on obligation or convenience, but on genuine understanding, honesty, and a love that had grown slowly and steadily into something neither of them had dared to hope for at the very beginning. Their story, unlikely as it had once seemed to everyone watching, had become, in the end, exactly the kind of love that proved every doubter wrong, standing as quiet testament to the truth that genuine worth was never something wealth or beauty alone could measure, and that sometimes the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the very one worth choosing above all others.